Hi, this is Dan Sullivan. I'd like to welcome you to the Multiplier Mindset Podcast. For anyone who knows the Bible, they know the story of the book of Exodus. And the Exodus is about Moses. The story is that Moses was a royal personage, but he was actually an Israelite and was adopted and became the leader of the Israelites, and at a certain point led the Israelites to leave Egypt and to go to the Promised Land. So that's the story. You know, there's movies on the Exodus, there's movies on Moses. So even if you're not a churchgoer, you probably know the story. And I've always used that story to point out there are two different kinds of freedom in the world, and that every individual would like to have greater freedom in their life. Usually the freedom that they're thinking about is what I call freedom from. So if we talk about the Israelites and we talk about Moses, that what the first part of the story is really about, that they wanted freedom from the bondage or slavery that they were experiencing in Egypt, and it was very easy to get them focused and to get them motivated to undertake a very, very dangerous escape, which involved crossing the Red Sea. As it's depicted in the Bible, there was a miracle which parted the seas for the Israelites, and when the Egyptians pursued them, the seas went back to the way they were and they were drowned. And that's the story. And it's a very old story, 3,000 years old at least. And then there's a very interesting thing called wandering in the wilderness. So they were in the Sinai Desert, but this wasn't the Promised Land. And so there was 40 years of wandering after they had escaped from Egypt. The whole point was that was the division between freedom from Egypt, and then there was the getting into the Promised Land, which was freedom to. So freedom to is a totally different kind of skill than freedom from. Moses was capable of having the Israelites free themselves from Egypt, but he wasn't a good enough leader. He didn't have the capability to actually take them into the Promised Land. So oftentimes when people think about freedom in their lives, they're mostly taken up and they're thinking about freedom from things that they don't like, freedom from a place they don't like, freedom from employment that they don't like, freedom from relationships, marriage, freedom from family ties that they don't like. And so most of the talk in the world about freedom is really freedom from something that you find oppressive, freedom that you find limiting and confining. And what you want to do is you want to free yourself from that. And I would say that anytime freedom is talked about in the news or it's depicted in the movies or in novels, you can almost invariably think that what they're really talking about is freedom from. And the reason is that freedom from generally will involve getting together with a lot of other people to free yourself up from something. And that's where politics is a lot about freedom from. But the real freedom, much more powerful freedom, I think that the second freedom is 10 times more powerful than the first freedom. So the second freedom is freedom to. You're not actually reacting to something you don't like. You are actually creating ahead of you something that you do love. It's a way of operating in the world. It's a way of experiencing yourself at a much better and much bigger area of performance and results. So what I notice in coaching entrepreneurs over 40 years, that I can help people very easily to free themselves up from something. That's an easy thing to do because all you need to do is get them to tell the truth about everything they don't like, and then to make decisions and communicate and take actions, and pretty soon they're free from it. And it doesn't mean that it's not scary, it doesn't mean it's not painful. It can be scary, there can be a cost to doing it, but it's usually pretty easy to think about. But then what I notice is that once they're freed up from, they still have a feeling that they're not free. And I think the reason is because the real freedom that you really want is to have a future that corresponds to your greatest visions about yourself, your greatest ideals about yourself. And you can't realize this second freedom by rebelling. It doesn't involve fighting. It doesn't involve getting away from it. It actually involves creativity, that you're going to create an entirely new situation for yourself. So a couple of years ago, after putting in more than 35 years as a coach who helped people free themselves up from all sorts of situations which were limiting their growth and frustrating them, I decided just to spend the rest of my life only working with those entrepreneurs whose real game was freedom too. So this was measured in 4 ways. They want greater time, freedom of time to do something. They want greater freedom of money in order to do something. They want greater freedom of relationship to do something. And they want greater freedom of purpose to actually achieve their highest goals and their biggest visions about how they want to operate in the world. And for me as a coach, this is, after having spent so much of my time helping people free themselves up, I'm finding this 10 times more enjoyable, actually helping people to use their most powerful thoughts about themselves and how they'd actually like to operate in the world. And their visions have nothing to do with how other people live their lives. This is custom designed future that we're heading towards. So if I go back to the biblical story, is that a lot of entrepreneurs are in Egypt and they become entrepreneurs and become better entrepreneurs by freeing themselves from an enormous number of conditions that they dislike. But that's only half the story. The real story that really brings about entrepreneurial happiness is really the story of who you now become once you're having experienced freedom from. Now you get to spend the rest of your life experiencing freedom too. This is where the great breakthroughs are made in the entrepreneurial world. This is where the great innovations take place. The entrepreneurs who operate more and more of their time in the area of freedom too, they create great new products, they innovate great new services, and they become legendary in the world. And that's really, for me, having devoted more than half my life to entrepreneurism, that's the real payoff, is having gone through the first stage of freeing yourself up from, then switching the gears and devoting the rest of your life to freedom too. And this is where you do the most amount of good for everyone in your life, because they're so inspired by your example of greater freedom to do something rather than greater freedom to get away from something.